The Reveries of the Solitary Walker. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Third Walk. I continue to learn while growing old. Solon frequently repeated this line in his old age. There is a sense in which I could also say it in mine, but what experience has made me acquire these past 20 years is a very sad bit of knowledge. Ignorance is still preferable. Adversity is undoubtedly a great teacher, but it charges dearly for its lessons, and the profit we draw from them is frequently not worth the price they have cost. Besides, before we have obtained all this learning by such tardy lessons, the occasion to use it passes. Youth is the time to study wisdom. Old age is the time to put it into practice. Experience always instructs, I admit, but it is profitable only for the time we have left to live. Is the moment when we have to die the time to learn how we should have lived? What benefit do I get from such late and painfully acquired insights concerning my fate and concerning other people's passions, whose work it is? By coming to know men better, I have only felt better the misery into which they have thrust me, and while this knowledge has shown me all their snares, it has not enabled me to avoid any. If only I had been able to preserve that stupid but pleasant trustfulness which made me the prey and plaything of my noisy friends for so many years, and kept me from having the least suspicion of all their plots, even though I was bound up in them. I was their dupe and victim, it is true, but I thought myself loved by them, and attributing to them as much friendship for me as they had inspired in me for them, my heart rejoiced. Those sweet illusions are destroyed. The sad truth that time and reason have unveiled to me by making me sense my misfortune has made me see that there was no remedy for it, and that all that was left was for me to resign myself to it. Thus all the experience proper to my age is useless for me now in this condition, and of no benefit for the future. We enter the list at our birth. We have them at death. What use is it to learn to handle our chariot better when we are at the end of the race? There is nothing more to think about than except how we will get out of it. If there is any study still appropriate for an old man, it is solely to learn to die, and this is precisely what we study least at my age. At this point, we think of anything but that. All old men hang on to life more than children, and leave it with more reluctance than youngsters. That is because all their toils have been for this very life. They see at its end that they have wasted their labors, all their cares, all their goods, all the fruits of their toilsome nights. They leave everything when they pass away. They have not dreamed of acquiring anything during their life that they might carry away at their death. I told myself all that when it was time to tell it to myself, and if I have not put my reflections to better use, it is not for lack of making them in time or of having mulled them over thoroughly. Cast from childhood into the whirlwind of the world, I soon learned from experience that I was not made to live in it, and that in it I would never reach the state my heart felt a need for. Ceasing, therefore, to seek among men the happiness I felt incapable of finding in their presence, my ardent imagination readily jumped beyond the interval of my life, which had barely begun, as though from a terrain which was foreign to me, to settle down in a quiet resting place where I could anchor myself. This feeling, nourished by education from the time of my childhood and reinforced during my whole life by this long web of miseries and misfortunes which has filled it, has at all times made me seek to know the nature and the destination of my being in a more interested and careful manner than I have found any other man seek to do. I have seen many who philosophized much more learnedly than I, but their philosophy was, so to speak, foreign to them. Wanting to be more knowledgeable than others, they studied the universe in order to know how it was ordered, just as they would have studied some machine they might have perceived through pure curiosity. They studied human nature to be able to speak knowingly about it, but not in order to know themselves. They toiled in order to instruct others, but not in order to enlighten themselves within. Several of them only wanted to do a book, any book, provided it was well received. When theirs was done and published, its argument no longer interested them in any way, unless it were to make others adopt it and to defend it in case it were attacked. But for the rest, they drew nothing from it for their own use, and were not even concerned whether this argument were false or true, provided it was not refuted. As for me, when I desired to learn, it was in order to know and not in order to teach. I have always believed that before instructing others, it was necessary to begin by knowing enough for oneself, and of all the studies I have tried to undertake during my life in the midst of men, there is hardly any I could not just as well have undertaken alone on a desert island, to which I might have been confined for the rest of my days. What we ought to do depends on a lot on what we ought to believe, and in everything which is not connected with the first needs of nature, our opinions are the rule of our actions. According to this principle, which has always been my own, I have sought frequently and for a long time to know the true end of my life in order to direct its use, and I soon became consoled about being so inept at skillfully handling myself in this world when I sensed that this end should not be sought in it. Born into a family in which morals and piety reigned, raised subsequently with tenderness in the home of a minister full of wisdom and religion, from the time of my most tender childhood I have received principles, maxims, others would say prejudices, which have never completely deserted me. Given into my own keeping, while still a child, and enticed to caresses, seduced by vanity, lured by hope, forced by necessity, I became a Catholic, but I always remained a Christian, and soon, won over by habit, my heart became sincerely attached to my new religion. The instructions and examples of Mime de Warens made me firmer in this attachment. The rural solitude in which I passed the flower of my youth, the study of good books to which I completely gave myself up, reinforced in her presence my natural disposition to affectionate feelings, and rendered me devout amongst in the manner of Fenelon, secluded meditation, the study of nature, and contemplation of the universe, force a solitary person to lift himself up incessantly to the author of things, to search with tender concern for the purpose in everything he sees, and the cause of everything he feels. When my fate threw me back into the torrent of the world, I no longer found anything in it which could flatter my heart for a moment. Longing for my sweet leisure followed me everywhere, and made everything apt to lead to fortune or honors that could be found within my reach seem indifferent and disgusting. Uncertain in my anxious desires, I hoped for little, I obtained less, and in the very rays of prosperity I felt that were I to obtain this happiness for which my heart was avid, but I did not know how to recognize. Thus, everything contributed to detach my affections from this world, even before the misfortunes which were destined to alienate me from it completely. I reached the age of 40, wavering between indigence and good fortune, between wisdom and aberration, full of vices, induced by habit, but without any bad propensity in my heart, living according to chance, without any principles determined by my reason, and inadvertent about my duties, without scorning them, yet often without being fully cognizant of them. From the time of my youth, I had set this age of 40 as the terminal point for my efforts to succeed, and as the one for all of my vain ambitions. I was fully resolved, once this age was reached, that whatever situation I might be in, I would struggle no longer to get out of it, and would spend the remainder of my days living from day to day without ever again concerning myself about the future. The moment having come, I executed this plan without difficulty, and even though my fortune then seemed to want to take a turn for the better, I renounced it not only without regret, but with actual pleasure. In releasing myself from all those lures and vain hopes, I fully gave myself up to carelessness and to the peace of mind which always constituted my most dominant pleasure and most lasting propensity. I forsook the world and its pomp. I renounced all finery, no more sword, no more watch, no more white stockings, gilding, or headdress, a very simple wig, a good coarse cloth garment, and, better than all that, I eradicated from my heart the cupidity and covetousness which give value to everything I was forsaking. I resigned the post I then held, for which I was in no way suited, and began to copy music at so much a page, an occupation which had always greatly appealed to me. I did not restrict my reform to external things. I felt that this reform was such as to require another of opinions, undoubtedly more painful but more necessary, and resolved not to do it twice. I undertook to submit my inner self to a severe examination, which would regulate it for the rest of my life, just as I wanted to find it at my death. A great revolution which had just taken place in me, another moral world which was unveiling itself to my observations, men's insane judgments, whose absurdity I was beginning to feel, without yet foreseeing, how much I would be victimized by them, the ever-growing need for some good besides literary vainglory, whose vapor had hardly touched me before I was already disgusted by it. The desire, in short, to follow for the rest of my course a less uncertain route than the one I had just spent the finest half on everything, forced me to this great review, for which I had long felt the need. I undertook it, therefore, and I neglected nothing within my power to carry the enterprise out well. It is from this epoch that I can date my complete renunciation of the world and this intense desire for solitude, which has not forsaken me since. The task I was undertaking could be carried out only in absolute seclusion. It required long and peaceful meditations that the tumult of society does not permit. This forced me to take up another way of life for a while, one in which I was subsequently so comfortable that, having since then interrupted it only when forced to and for a short time, I have taken it up again wholeheartedly, and have restricted myself to it without difficulty whenever I could. Afterward, when men reduced me to living alone, I found that by sequestering me to make me miserable, they had done more for my happiness than I had ever been able to do. I gave myself up to the toil I had undertaken with a zeal proportionate both to the importance of the matter and to the need I felt I had of it. I was living then among modern philosophies. I was living then among modern philosophers who hardly resembled the ancient ones. Instead of removing my doubts and ending my irresolution, they had shaken all the certainty I thought I had concerning the things that were most important for me to know. Ardent missionaries of atheism and very imperious dogmatists, there was no way that they would, without anger, put up with anyone daring to think other than they did about any point whatever. I had often defended myself quite feebly, due to hatred for dispute and little talent for sustaining it, but I never adopted their dismal doctrine. And this resistance to such intolerant men, who had their own interests, moreover, was not the least of the causes which stirred up their animosity. They had not persuaded me, but they had troubled me. Their arguments had shaken me without having ever convinced me. I found no good reply to them, but I felt there must be one. I accused myself less of error than of ineptitude, and my heart replied to them better than my reason. Finally, I said to myself, will I let myself be tossed about eternally by the sophisms of better speakers, when I am not even sure that the opinions they preach and are so eager to make others adopt are really their own? The passions which govern their doctrines and their interest in having this or that believed make it impossible to penetrate what they themselves believe. Can one expect good faith among the leaders of a faction? Their philosophy is for others. I need one for me. Let me look for it with all my strength while there is still time, so that I will have a set rule of conduct for the rest of my days. Here I am in the full maturity of age, in all the strength of my understanding. I am already beginning to decline. If I continue to wait, I will no longer have the use of my strength for my delayed deliberation. My intellectual faculties will have lost some of their agility. I will not do as well what I can do today in the best possible way. Let me seize this favorable moment. It is the epoch of my external and material reform. Let it also be that of my intellectual and moral reform. Let me settle my opinions and my principles once and for all, and let me be for the remainder of my life what I will have found I ought to be after having carefully thought it over. I carried out this project slowly and with various fresh starts, but with all the effort and all the attention of which I was capable. I felt intensely that the tranquillity of the remainder of my days and my total lot depended on it. At first I found myself in such a labyrinth of encumbrances, difficulties, objections, twistings, and darkness that 20 times tempted to abandon everything. I was ready to renounce such a futile quest and to abide by the rules of common prudence in my deliberations without seeking for anything more in principles. I had so much trouble unraveling, but this very prudence was so foreign to me, I felt myself so unlikely to acquire it, that to take it for my guide was nothing other than to want to seek across seas and storms without a rudder or compass, an almost inaccessible lighthouse which pointed out no harbor for me. I persisted. For the first time in my life I had courage, and to its success I owe having been able to endure the horrible fate which from that time began to envelop me without my having had the least suspicion of it. After the most ardent and sincere seeking that has perhaps ever been made by any mortal, I determined for my whole life all the sentiments important for me to have, and though I may have deceived myself in my conclusions, I am at least sure that my error cannot be imputed to me as a crime, for I made every effort to keep myself from it. To be sure, I have no doubt but what the prejudices of childhood and the secret wishes of my heart made the scale lean to the side and most consoling for me. It is difficult to keep ourselves from believing what we so ardently desire, and who can doubt that most men's interest in admitting or rejecting the judgments of the next life determines their faith, and does so according to their hope or fear. All of that could dazzle my judgment, I agree, but not alter my good faith, for I feared deceiving myself about anything. If everything depended on the use made of this life, it was important for me to know it, so that I could just least turn it to the best account within my power while there was still time, and not be a complete dupe. But, given the way I felt myself disposed, what I had to dread most in the world was risking the eternal lot of my soul to enjoy the goods of this world, which have never appeared very worthwhile to me. I confess, again, that I did not always satisfactorily remove all these difficulties which had bothered me, and about which our philosophers had so often battered my ears. But, resolved to settle once and for all these matters, human intelligence has so little hold over the finding impenetrable mysteries and insoluble objections on all sides. I adopted for each question the sentiment which seemed to me the best established by direct means and the most believable in itself, without paying attention to objections I could not resolve, but which were refuted by other no less strong objections in the opposite system. A dogmatic tone about these matters is suitable only to charlatans, but it is important to have one's own feeling and to choose it with all the maturity of judgment one can put into it. If we fall into error in spite of that, we could not justly suffer the penalty, since we would not be at fault. That is unshakable principle. That is the unshakable principle which serves as the basis of my security. The result of my painful seeking was approximately that which I have since set down in the profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar, a work vilely prostituted and profaned among the present generation, but which may one day make a revolution among men, if good sense and good faith are ever reborn among them. Since then, having remained content with the principles I had adopted after such a long and reflective meditation, I have made them the immovable rule of my conduct and faith, without bothering myself any longer about the objections I had not been able to resolve, or about those I have not been able to foresee, and which presented themselves anew to my mind from time to time. They sometimes bothered me, but never shook me. I have always said to myself, those are all only metaphysical quibbles and subtleties, which have no weight next to the fundamental principles adopted by my reason, confirmed by my heart, and which all carry the seal of inner assent in the silence of the passions. In matters so much greater than human understanding, will and objection, I cannot resolve overturn a whole body of doctrine so solid, so well integrated, and formed with so much meditation and care, so very suited to my reason, to my heart, to my whole being, and reinforced by the inner assent I feel to be lacking in all the others? No. Vain arguments will never destroy the congruity I perceive between my immortal nature, the constitution of this world, and the physical order I see reigning in it. In the corresponding moral order, whose arrangement I discovered by of by my seeking, in the corresponding moral order, whose arrangement I discovered by my seeking, I find the supports I need to endure the miseries of my life. In any other arrangement, I would live without resource and die without hope. I would be the most unhappy of creatures. Let me hold, then, to this one, which alone suffices to render me happy in spite of fortune and men. Do not this deliberation and the conclusion I drew from it seem to have been dictated by heaven itself to prepare me for the fate which awaited me and to enable me to endure it? What would I have become? What would I yet become during the frightful periods of anguish which awaited me and the unbelievable situation I am reduced to for the rest of my life, if, having remained without a refuge where I could escape from my implacable persecutors without compensation for the disgrace to which they submit me in this world, and without hope of ever obtaining the justice due me, I have seen myself completely surrendered up to the most horrible lot any mortal has undergone on earth. Repeating, What would I have become? What would I yet become during the frightful periods of anguish which awaited me, and the unbelievable situation I am reduced to for the rest of my life, if, having remained without a refuge where I could escape from my implacable persecutors, without compensation for the disgrace to which they submit me in this world, and without hope for ever obtaining the justice due me, I had seen myself completely surrendered up to the most horrible lot any mortal has undergone on earth. While serene in my innocence, I imagined only esteem and benevolence for me among men, and while my open and confiding heart poured itself out to friends and brothers, traitors silently entwined me with nets forged in the pits of hell. Taken unawares by the most unforeseen of all misfortunes, and those most terrible, for a proud soul dragged through the mud, without ever knowing by whom or for what, thrust into an abyss of ignominy, enveloped in horrible darkness, through which I discerned only sinister objects. I was floored by the first surprise attack, and I would never have recovered from the despondency this unforeseen kind of misfortune cast me into had I not stored up reserves of strength ahead of time in order to pick myself up from my fall. Only after years of agitation, when my spirits were finally restored, and I began to be myself again, did I feel the worth of the resources I had stored up for adversity. Settled on all the things it was important for me to judge, I saw, when I compared my maxims to my situation, that I was given far more importance to the insane judgments of men and to the petty events of this short life than they possessed. Since this life is only a series of ordeals, it matters little what these ordeals were like, provided the effect they were destined for resulted from them. The consequently, the greater, stronger, and more multiplied the ordeals, the more advantageous it was to know how to endure them. All the most intense pains lose their strength for anyone who sees the great and sure compensation for them, and the certainty of this compensation was the principal fruit I had drawn out of my preceding meditations. It is true that in the midst of the innumerable outrages and immeasurable indignities by which I felt myself overwhelmed on my hope and trouble my tranquillity. Again, it is true that in the midst of the innumerable outrages and immeasurable indignities by which I felt myself overwhelmed on all sides, intervals of worry and doubt occasionally arose to shake my hope and trouble my tranquillity. The powerful objections I had not been able to resolve then presented themselves to my mind more forcefully to finish striking me down precisely at those to give way to the discouragement. Frequently new arguments I heard came back to mind in support of those which had already tormented me. Ah, I said to myself then, when my heart was constricting so as to suffocate me, who will keep me from despair if my lot is so horrible that I no longer see anything but idle fancies in the consolations my reason furnished me? If thus, destroying its own work, it overturns the whole support of hope and confidence it had stored up for me in this adversity. What kind of a support are illusions which delude me alone in the world whole? The whole present generation sees only errors and prejudices in the sentiments with which I alone nourish myself. It finds truth and evidence in the system opposed to mine. It even seems incapable of believing that I adopt my own in good faith, and although I give myself up to it wholeheartedly, even I find it has insurmountable difficulties, which are impossible for me to resolve, but which do not prevent me from persisting in it. Am I then alone wise, alone enlightened among mortals? To believe that this is the why, to believe that this is the way things are, it is sufficient that they suit me. No. Again. Am I then alone wise, alone enlightened among mortals? To believe that this is the way things are, is it sufficient that they suit me? Can I put enlightened trust in appearances which have nothing solid in the eyes of other men, and which would seem illusory even to me, if my heart did not confirm my reason? Would it not have been better to engage my persecutors with equal weapons by adopting their maxims, than to remain prey to their attacks because of the idle fancies of my own maxims, without acting to repulse them? I believe myself wise, but I am only a dupe, a victim, and a martyr of a vain error. How many times in these moments of doubt and uncertainty was I ready to abandon myself to despair? If I had ever spent an entire month in this state, my life and I would have been done for. But although these crises used to occur quite frequently, they have always been short. And now, even though I am not yet completely free of them, they are so rare and so fleeting that they do not even have the strength to disturb my calm. They are light worries, which affect my soul no more than a feather which falls into the river can alter the water's current. I felt that to put the same points I had previously settled into question all over again presupposed that I had new insights, a more formed judgment, or more zeal for the truth than at the time of my seeking. Since none of these is or can apply to my case, there could be no solid reason for me to prefer opinions which tempted me in a moment of overwhelming despair, but which would only augment my misery, to feelings adopted in the vigor of age, in complete maturity of mind, after the most reflective examination, and in times when the calm of my life left me no other dominant interest than that of knowing the truth. Today, when my heart is constricted from distress, my soul weighed down by vexations, my imagination terrified, and my head troubled by the many frightful mysteries which surround me, today, when all of my faculties, weakened by old age and anxieties, have lost all their spring, shall I wantonly deprive myself of all the resources I had stored up? Shall I place more trust in my declining reason, thereby making myself unjustly unhappy, than in my full and vigorous reason, thereby getting compensation for the evils I suffer without having deserved them? No, I am not wiser, more learned, or of better faith than when I settled all those great questions. I was not unaware then of the difficulties I allow myself to be troubled by today. They did not stop me, and if some new one arise, which have not yet been perceived. They are the sophisms of a subtle metaphysics, which is unable to weigh the eternal truths admitted at all times by all wise men, recognized by all nations, and engraved on the human heart in indelible characters. While meditating about these matters, I knew that human understanding, circumscribed by the senses, could not embrace them in their full extent. I therefore limited myself to what was within my reach, without getting myself involved in what went beyond it. This decision was reasonable. I embraced it previously, and held myself to it with the assent of my heart and of my reason. On what grounds would I renounce it today, when so many powerful reasons ought to keep me attached to it? What danger do I see in following it? What profit would I find in abandoning it? By adopting the doctrine of my persecutors, would I also adopt their morality? This rootless and fruitless morality, which they pompously display in books or in some striking scene on the stage, without any of it ever penetrating the heart or the reason? Or else this other secret and cruel morality, the inner doctrine of all their initiates, for which the other only serves as a mask, which is the only one they follow in their conduct, and which they have so skillfully practiced with respect to me. This purely offensive morality is of no use for defense, and is good only for aggression. How would it be of use to me in the condition to which they have reduced me? My innocence alone sustains me in my misfortunes, and how much unhappier would I make myself if, ridding myself of this single but powerful resource, I substituted wickedness for it? Would I reach their level in the art of harming? And were I to succeed, from what evil would the one I might do them relieve me? I would lose my self-esteem and gain nothing in its place. Reasoning in this way with myself, I succeeded in no longer allowing myself to be shaken in my principles by captious arguments, by insoluble objections, or by the difficulties which went beyond my reach and perhaps beyond that of the human mind. My own mind remains as firmly tempered as I was able to make it, and has become so well accustomed to resting there in the shelter of my conscience that no foreign doctrine, old or new, can any longer move it or trouble my rest for an instant. Fallen into mental languor and heaviness, I have forgotten even the reasonings on which I grounded my belief and my maxims, but I will never forget the conclusions I drew from them with the approval of my conscience and of my reason, and I hold to them henceforth. Let all the philosophers come cavil in opposition. They will waste their time and labors. For the rest of my life, with regard to everything, I hold to the course I took when I was in more of a condition to choose well. Serene in this disposition, I find in it, along with self-contentment, the hope and the consolation I need in my situation. It is not possible that a solitude so complete, so permanent, so sad in itself, that the ever perceptible and ever active animosity of the whole present generation, and that the indignities this generation incessantly overwhelms me with, will not sometimes throw me into despondency. Faltering hope and discouraging doubts still return from time to time to trouble my soul and to fill it with sadness. At that moment Unable to perform the mental operations needed to reassure myself, I must recall my former resolutions. The cares and attention, the heartfelt sincerity that I applied in forming them come back to my mind then and restore all of my confidence. Thus I refuse all new ideas as baleful errors, which have only a false appearance and are good only to trouble my rest. Confined thus within the narrow sphere of my former knowledge, I do not share with Solon the happiness of being able to learn each day while growing old, and I even ought to keep myself from the dangerous pride of wanting to learn what I am henceforth unable to know well. But if few acquisitions remain for me to hope for in the way of useful insights, very important ones remain for me to make in the way of the virtues necessary for my condition. In that regard, it is time to endow and adorn my soul with learning it might carry away with it when, delivered from this body with clouds and blinds, it, and seeking truth without a veil, it will perceive the wretchedness of all the knowledge our false learned men are so vain without. It will bemoan the moments wasted in this life trying to acquire that knowledge. But patience, sweetness, resignation, integrity, and impartial justice are goods we carry away with ourselves, and with which we can perpetually endow ourselves, not fearing that even in death they would lose their worth for us. It is to this unique and useful study that I devote the rest of my old age. I will be happy if by the progress I make with myself I learn to leave life not better, for that is not possible, but more virtuous than I entered it.